George Pickens' recent ADP is down. We'll explain why on this episode of the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast.
You are Locked On Dynasty Football, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. Here are your hosts, Marcus Mosher and Kate Madjuk.
Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. I am your host, Marcus Mosher. You can follow me on Twitter at Marcus_Mosher. Joining me today, as always, is Kate Madjuk. You can follow her on Twitter at Kate Madjuk. And on today's show, we're taking a look at the latest batch of ADP from Dynasty League football, talking about the biggest risers and fallers. And Kate, let's start with your Steelers. I'm going to use my Pittsburgh accent here. Talking about George Pickens' ADP going down. It's been a while. Before we even got the DK Metcalf news, we saw his ADP drop from 31st overall down to 48 overall. He's outside of the top 15 receivers. I believe outside the top 20 receivers. How are we valuing George Pickens now that they've got DK Metcalf on the other side? They've given him a big contract. We know Pittsburgh's not going to pay George Pickens. What do we do?
Here's the thing. I don't think the Steelers are going to pay George Pickens. I also have a little bit of, I don't know. I'm not saying that every wide receiver that leaves Pittsburgh turns into dust or smithereens, because that's not necessarily the case, but it has been the case recently.
None of them were able to match their fantasy value elsewhere.
Yeah, like it's been a tough environment. And I also think, like, generally speaking, we haven't seen some of the top tier wide receivers from the Pittsburgh Steelers thrive elsewhere. And I think part of that is the culture match. I think part of that is the influence Mike Tomlin has to apparently help some of these guys who are maybe a little less level-headed keep their S together, like I think there's a real element there. So looking at the fact that, George Pickens going to be probably hitting the market or, maybe traded, like I don't see him being a long-term answer in Pittsburgh. It does give you a little bit of concern. But what I do think George Pickens has is a ton of upside. Now, hasn't always translated to consistency, and that's been a big part of some of the struggles that I think we've seen from George Pickens. I don't think that, honestly, Pittsburgh is necessarily the best fit for him and his skill set, because if he wants to find consistency, they're going to have to use him, I think, over the middle of the field. Like, there's one point last year where they were talking about George Pickens maybe getting some more looks out of the slot, getting more generated touches, and he seemed amped about that. Like, he made a comparison to Amon-Ra St. Brown, saying, like, yeah, like basically, I want to be used that way. Like, just get the ball in my hands and let me do stuff, right? And we didn't really see that. And I think we know Pittsburgh's preference is just to avoid the middle of the field in general. Like, is there a better place that he could see his skill set utilized? Yes. So I think all of these factors, plus the lack of quarterback, plus the addition of DK Metcalf, we might see his value take an even greater hit in the months to come.
I think so as well, because I'm of the belief that I don't think Pittsburgh trades him. And I know that's been kind of rumored for a little bit now. Like, hey, you can't have both these guys together. And I kind of agree. I don't think their skill sets fit together particularly well, because you kind of want to have
a very duplicative skill set.
Absolutely. And I think you generally would like to have somebody on the outside that can maybe run some more of the crisp routes that could be used as a Z receiver. But I think Pittsburgh clearly wants to try to win right now, and they're just not going to get enough in a return from George Pickens to make it worth their while. And I go back to the draft, right? This was somebody who had first-round talent, Kate, top 15 talent, but he was off the draft boards of several people. Go read some of the reporting at The Athletic or from Bob McGinn. Like, he just rubbed people the wrong way. And I don't think anything he's done in the first 3 years of his career would have anybody changing their opinion. So I got to believe the options for him, like via trade, are going to be small. You're probably looking at a day 3 pick. I think Pittsburgh would rather just hold on to Pickens, hope things work out, and give yourself another deep threat receiver. The problem is how valuable is that in Dynasty? not super valuable. Even last year when he was the sole number one and the other receivers competing for targets were Van Jefferson, Mike Williams, and Calvin Austin, he was fine, but it wasn't like he was this every week wide receiver one. He was more of a low end wide receiver two, Kate. And now I think we have to value him as like a flex play most weeks, unless something changes at the quarterback position where they finally get a quarterback that can optimize two receivers. I think this is somebody that you're probably trying to avoid in your dynasty leagues.
I mean, I will say 900 receiving yards, 3 touchdowns in 14 games. Not the worst, right? Did have his best fantasy points per game ranking. Unfortunately, that was wide receiver 35. He will have spikes, and I think that's just the nature of his play style, but definitely not conducive to that every week lock as a starter. But again, until they come up with an answer at the quarterback position, I don't necessarily know when that's going to change, especially with DK Metcalf playing opposite him. So all of those factors put together, like I don't know that there's going to be a great answer at quarterback right now. There's not. 2026 draft could be a sweet spot for the Steelers to find their potential quarterback, but a lot of that might hinge on them finishing much lower in the rankings than they probably hope, based on the recent moves they made. So it just kind of feels like they're in a little bit of purgatory. And
Hey, can I ask you about the dynasty value right now? Because again, this is dynasty value from February, but it's our latest batch that we have. DK Metcalf was wide receiver 21. George Pickens was wide receiver 28. I've got to imagine for you that gap has grown quite a bit, right?
I'll take DK Metcalf there.
Okay, that's what I assume.
Yeah.
So let's talk about George Pickens, wide receiver 28. Some of the receivers that are going after him that you would rather have. Brandon Ayuk, wide receiver 31.
I'll probably take Pickens there.
Okay. Jaden Reed, wide receiver 35.
I'll take Reed.
How about somebody like Luther Burden, wide receiver 33?
That one is more landing spot dependent for me.
Okay. All right. How about even a short-term rental? What about someone like Devontae Adams, wide receiver 43, playing with the Rams?
Marcus, it's George Pickens. Stop.
I'll take Adams. But so what we're looking at,
okay, explain yourself, because I think that's a bold take. Explain yourself.
I think just Adams is going to be more productive this year. And I think with Pickens, he's one of these guys that I just worry about. Like, could he crash out and be out of the league by 2027? You're betting on the upside, but we're going into year 4 now. At some point, that upside needs to be realized, and we just haven't gotten there. It's clear that the Steelers don't think it's coming. Otherwise, you don't trade for DK Metcalf and give him a monster deal. I would just rather take the safety of Adams playing with Sean McVay and Matt Stafford for the next 2 years.
I do think that's an interesting point, is like, it's not just the presence of DK Metcalf in the offense that leaves you with question marks. It's about, what do the moves say about the Steelers' feelings about George Pickens? Because ideally, your goal would be that George Pickens develops, like, obviously, again, really different body types. Like, physically, they couldn't be more opposite from each other, but their play styles are very similar. So, like, when you're thinking stylistically, like, what do you hope the ceiling for George Pickens is? Probably hope it's something like a DK Metcalf. So if you think that his ceiling will be realized and that his ceiling could be DK Metcalf, you don't then go out and trade for DK Metcalf. And, I think a second round pick is a great value, but he just literally got the largest total value wide receiver contract ever. Like, that speaks.
And I think it's the style, right? Like, if the Steelers would have traded for like Brandon Ayuk, again, let's assume he's healthy and that trade happens this year. I think Brandon Ayuk's style and Pickens' style meshes well together, right?
Mm-hmm.
But DK is just like the bigger and better version of George Pickens.
Yes.
The Steelers already had that on the roster, and they felt like, hey, we need to go out and spend a second round pick and give this guy a monster contract. I just think there is a lot of uncertainty about Pickens. On top of, we're going into year 4, and he's never been what's the highest fantasy finish that we've had for George Pickens?
Well, on a points per game basis, wide receiver 35, and points per game is the metric that I'm going to roll with because
So we're talking about not even a top 30 receiver. You're talking about basically a flex play in most weeks.
Yikes. Yeah. But again, like it does make you wonder though. So wide receiver is a position that generally speaking, I like to roll with talent as opposed to like maybe situation. And like I try to get as many talented wide receivers on my roster as possible because I generally think like situations will wax and wane in terms of, generally speaking, unless you're the Browns offensive play callers and, quarterback play and all that stuff. Like generally speaking, I think, over the period of a couple of years, that's going to be a wash and we're going to see the talent come to fruition. Like Terry McLaurin, a late bloomer, but a great example of that. We all knew the talent level. We were waiting for the stars to align and the rest of the offense, and they finally did. And boom, he's a top 10 wide receiver. Like George Pickens, I think, has some of that to his game, and the fact that, like, yeah, if he had the opportunity, if the stars align, like, what do you think of the pure talent of George Pickens? And that I think is maybe the more interesting question.
All right, okay, let's get to Chuba Hubbard because Chuba Hubbard just got some competition in the backfield, or did he? Let's talk about it next. This episode is brought to you by Monarch Money. If you ever checked your bank account and wonder, where did all my money go? I do this every day. Between dining out, online shopping, and entertainment, it's easy to lose track. But that's where Monarch Money comes in, your personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money isn't just a budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center. You can track all of your accounts, your investments, and spending all in one place so you can stop just managing your money and start building your wealth. I just started using Monarch Money. I can't believe how much money I was wasting. And now I'm budgeting smarter and I'm saving more. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money. Use Locked On NFL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. That is monarchmoney.com, code Locked On NFL for half off in your first year. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. I'd like to thank you for suffering through my terrible Yinzer accent. We're not going to do that anymore. We're going to talk about Chuba Hubbard, who we saw a big increase in his dynasty value over the last month. He went from 84th overall to 61. Now, a lot of that is based on the news of Jonathan Brooks going to miss the entire 2025 season with a torn ACL. We expected the Panthers to bring somebody in here to compete for snaps or to give Chuba Hubbard a breather. They did release Miles Sanders, but then now they've signed Rico Dowdle, the love of my life, to be the RB2 in Carolina. How concerned are you about Chuba Hubbard?
I'm not super concerned. I think, generally speaking, when we're looking at the running back position, it's pretty rare in general, unless you have a superstar transcendent running back, for a guy to get, almost 80 to 90% of these RB touches in any given season, right? Like this is a player, a position that is generally a little bit more prone to some injuries. I don't want to say prone, but like we consider them a higher injury risk because of the carry volume, because of the hits, because of just the nature of the physicality of the position. I think Rico Dowdle is probably closer to the Miles Sanders role in this offense, which wasn't all that significant, than it is to the Chuba Hubbard role, which is very significant.
So you and I have been talking about how much we love Chuba Hubbard, and we thought he was a major value back in December and January. Now he's up to RB19. And I still think that's a value. You're talking about somebody last year, whenever he was on the field, was giving you RB1 production. And again, as much as I like Rico Dowdle, who was a 1,000-yard back for the Cowboys, despite really not playing that much the first 6-7 weeks of the season, I think the contract tells the story. They gave Rico Dowdle a 1-year deal worth $2.5 million as the base, with incentives that can get him up to $6 million, but it's a $2.5 million deal. Okay, that's like special teamers make more money than that. Long snappers make more money than that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Good
Yeah.
bloggers make more money than that. But I'm saying this is not a lot of money. That is backup running back money. And I know Rico Dowdle performed really well last year. I just don't think Chuba Hubbard should feel threatened here at all.
Yeah, I think it's just about like following the money here. I mean, Chuba Hubbard, he earned that contract that he got for him. It was a surprisingly large contract, especially considering like we didn't know that, we weren't going to have Jonathan Brooks available in the 2025 season. That was the biggest surprise. But this is a guy with back-to-back seasons of 900 plus rushing yards, back-to-back seasons of 170 plus receiving yards. Saw a nice jump in terms of his yards per carry average, RB13 in fantasy points per game, ranked 12th in weighted opportunities per player profiler. This is a guy that like he absolutely thrived in this offense. 11 touchdowns in 2024. Are you kidding me? On that offense? That tells me everything I need to know. And when I'm kind of assigning concern levels for signings, I do tend to weigh a little bit more heavily on the money aspect. And what Rico Dowdle's contract tells me is that they're not really planning for him to be the guy, or else they might have paid him like it.
Yeah. So my question for you is, if you want to be in the Chuba Hubbard business this year, what's the best way to do it? Is it to trade for him now before the draft? Is it to wait till after the draft and we get some of these more, some of these rookies entering the fold, pushing his value down? What do you think the plan is here?
I kind of want to do it right now while we are still fresh off the heels of this signing. Rico Dowdle, like one of the better running backs in this free agency class at the running back position. It wasn't a deep free agency class. So I think when you're looking circumstantially, I want to take advantage of that news. But some of that I think depends on like taking the temperature of your league mates and seeing what are their thoughts on Rico Dowdle, and that's the temperature check I want to make. But I think this is a good time to do it, even though we've seen his value rise just a bit.
Well, and I think this is a good time to trade for him now because draft picks are so much more valuable to trade. Like if you want to send like a 3rd round pick for Chuba Hubbard, doing it now before the NFL draft happens and before your rookie drafts happens is the way to go. Because once the draft happens and once you're in your draft and you get to the 3rd round, again, I'm just making this up.
Yeah,
you're going to look at the names and be pretty underwhelmed with who's available. Those draft picks always hold more weight a month before the draft. So if you're needing a running back, would you flip? I mentioned a 3rd. Would you give a 2nd round pick for Chuba Hubbard? Or is that too much?
If it's like a mid to late 2nd, yes, I would.
Okay. I think it's going to a little bit will depend on the landing spot, but like, yeah, I think I generally agree with you. If you are trying to win this year and you have picked 22, 23, and you just want a better RB2, I think I'm good with it.
Yeah, I think that feels like a decent price tag. Again, we've mentioned that this is a deep running back class, but right now we are in that kind of awkward point in the pre-draft process where what's the GIF I'm thinking of where there's a guy and he's looking at the box and he's like, but
it could be
something else behind that box.
You could have a boat or whatever inside the box. It could even be a boat, right?
Yeah.
The Family Guy GIF. Yep.
Yes. That's what Chuba Hubbard is for me right now. Like you could either have Chuba Hubbard or you could have the box who might
You're hoping
have
turns
Hubbard
into Chuba Hubbard at that spot. Yeah, I agree. So I think the optimal strategy is to go out, get Chuba Hubbard now, and maybe we'll even see a little bit of a dip in his value now that Rico signed there, because there are going to be people that are stressing out about a 1,200-yard back joining him in the backfield. There's also the concern like, okay, this is only a 1-year rental for Chuba Hubbard because we know Jonathan Brooks is coming back in 2026. I agree with you. I think right now is the time to buy. Okay, let's talk about Jordan Love, who has seen his ADP take a major hit over the last month. What's going on there? We'll tell you next. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. March Madness is here, and FanDuel is giving you the chance to get in on the action like never before. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. That is 200 extra bucks to use on everything from buzzer beaters to Cinderella stories to even who is cutting down the nets. I've got my eye on a couple underdogs and sleepers this year. I'll make sure I share them with you on X later next week. And FanDuel is making it easy to pick them with spreads, totals, and game props. And with tournament games happening almost every single day, there's always something exciting to bet on. Plus, the FanDuel app is so easy to use. And when you win, you get paid instantly. No waiting around. So visit FanDuel.com and get in on the college hoops action all tournament long. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. For your second listen, check out the Locked On NFL Draft Show with Damian Parson and Keith Sanchez. Now that the season is over, get the latest draft rankings, rumors, and news every day, and find Locked On NFL Draft on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcasts. All right, Kate, let's talk about Jordan Love. He's seen a pretty major fall in his Dynasty ADP. At one point, he was being drafted as a top 7, top 8 quarterback. He's down to quarterback 13. He's been passed by Justin Herbert, CJ Stroud, Kyler Murray, Bo Nix, Caleb Williams, and Drake May. Do you agree with that fall?
Here's the thing. Looking at his 2024 season, it was a disappointment in a massive way, I think, compared to what the expectations were based on his season, first season as a starter. In most efficiency metrics, Jordan Love was average or below average per PFF, 50th percentile in clean pocket grade, 52nd percentile standard drop back grade, 93rd percentile in avoided sack rate. So that's a plus, but 24th percentile play action grade. Generally speaking, he was average in most senses this past season. But what I do think is worth considering that I think is probably playing more into his value than we'd want to admit is the injury component. We saw Jordan Love get injured. What was it? Week 1, literally game 1. And I do think that affected the way he played the game. And I don't necessarily know that he knew how to adjust his game to make up for maybe some of the lack of mobility due to injury. So part of me is kind of looking at Jordan Love and saying, have we maybe reached the tipping point where the upside is worth it? Because this is a guy that, over the past 2 seasons, 8 games of 3+ passing touchdowns. He's had a lot of production. There's been a little bit of Brett Favre to his game in this sort of up and down wild, wild west play style. But generally speaking, that can be conducive to some upside.
Yeah, I think some of the shine of Jordan Love has worn off a little bit. And that's not to say that he's not a valuable quarterback for Dynasty and for fantasy, but there are quarterbacks out there that offer more upside. And I think there's quarterbacks out there that just have way better weapons that you're maybe betting on as well. I think I would buy him at quarterback 13. The hard part is the rookie quarterbacks ahead of him, May, Williams, Nix, because those guys are getting the artificial bump because they're second-year quarterbacks that, hey, they've got unknown potential. It could be a box, right? Or it could be a boat, right?
It could be a boat or it could be Jordan Love. Nobody knows.
But I think Jordan Love and CJ Stroud are both going through this a little bit where it's we had such high expectations for them after their first full year of starting. Year 2 wasn't quite as good, and now we're just not quite as excited about them. So I'm still buying Jordan Love, but no, I'm not valuing him as a top 7 or 8 quarterback. And Kate, one of the things that I've come to realize is that the gap between quarterback 10, which is Bo Nix, and the gap between quarterback 18, which is Jared Goff, isn't all that great. And what I would like to do in these startup drafts, or what I've been doing, is just trying to wait and grab the cheapest option here because I don't think there's that big of a difference.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely fair. And I think you could even include QB8 in that mix. That's CJ Stroud right now. And again, a player that I think if I'm looking from a fantasy perspective, right, maybe not so much the real life NFL quarterback component, who could be a better pure passer. I think that goes to CJ Stroud for me pretty easily when in the right situation. But like for fantasy, I do wonder if, despite the fact that he's being drafted like 6 spots behind CJ Stroud, like, is there a world where Jordan Love just has the better upside? And I do think that you're probably right where, yeah, there's like this top tier of quarterbacks. There's Lamar Jackson, there's Jaden Daniels, Josh Allen, and then there's like a pretty big tier break after some of the quote unquote elites where it feels like everybody just kind of has the same value and you could swap them one for one. And I think, okay, that seems like a fair trade. Like, we're in an interesting spot with this range, but Jordan Love, if he continues to fall, I do think there's a point where you just got to pull the trigger and trade for Jordan Love.
I agree. I was also hopeful that they would go out and get a true wide receiver one this offseason. But it just didn't happen. It doesn't seem like it's going to happen. Maybe it'll be in the draft. But now you look at those weapons, Kate, with likely without Christian Watson for most of 2025. We've got Jaden Reed, Dontavian Wicks, Romeo Doubs. It's fine, but it's not like some of the other quarterbacks that are ahead of him. Like even Caleb Williams with DJ Moore and Roma Dunze and Cole Kmet. Like, it's fine. I think this is appropriate for him, but I'm not dropping him even any further than this.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I do think that, like, generally speaking, again, we can see situation be a little fluid. I do think that if we saw Jordan Love, get a bona fide wide receiver one, which, to be clear, I think Jaden Reed very much could have been for them, but he's not. I do think that, like, imagine if you plucked T. Higgins, who still doesn't have a long-term deal, got another franchise tag from the Bengals. If the Bengals decide to tag and trade and they sent him to the Green Bay Packers, I have a feeling that Jordan Love's ADP would take a nice bump. And I think he'd be closer to that CJ Stroud range. So I do think what's really important to remember, though, is like good offensive ecosystem, good play caller. We've seen the upside that Jordan Love has as a fantasy quarterback. And I mean, heck, the Steelers just traded for DK Metcalf, right? The Seahawks just completely obliterated their entire organization, dismantled it from head to toe in like a 5-hour window. Like, things change so fast in the NFL that Jordan Love could have a wide receiver one before you know it. And then suddenly you're looking at yourself kicking rocks, wondering why you didn't just make the move to trade for Jordan Love just because he didn't have a wide receiver one.
All right, that is it for today's show. We want to thank you for making Locked On Dynasty Football your first listen every single day. Go check out the channel on YouTube, download the podcast wherever you get your podcast. We are free and available on all platforms. On Friday's show, we're going to talk about Michigan tight end Colston Loveland, who I really, really like. I can't wait to get into the tape, the metrics. Make sure you tune in for that. Follow Kate on Twitter at Kate Majuk. I'm at Marcus_Mosher, and we'll see you right back here tomorrow.